Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh, and today we're going to be talking about the topping A50S. Now, a little bit of a precursor to this review. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend going and watching the topping A90 review because we're going to be kind of referencing that a lot. Now, that amplifier is coming in at $500. This one, $200. Size differences, amplification differences, all that fun stuff. But I'm going to be kind of talking about it and mentioning it a few times in this review. Mainly because I think that this thing is basically a mini A90, which is a great thing. This thing is really a bulldog of an amplifier. It's little, it's miniature, but it packs a wallop. Now, before we get started, Appos did send this out for a review. They are not paying, asking, or otherwise trying to influence me to say anything good or bad about this product. You can find links to their website and this product in the description. So the first thing to talk about here is going to be the size. And this thing is miniature. It's quite small. And it is very, very dense. It's actually a really well-made unit. It's kind of got that same density feeling as like a Mac Mini, but obviously not quite as big, but it feels like a brick. Like you could, you could hurt somebody with this thing. Now, part of why I'm mentioning it in this conversation is because a lot of the same amplification techniques that are in the A90 are also in the A50S. It's just got a little bit less power, not the same feature set, stuff like that, but still, there's a lot of crossover between these two, even if they look quite a bit different. Now, we'll talk about competitors like the Magnus sort of near the end where I do kind of a competition thing. But I will say this thing, as of right now, as an amplifier for $200, I think is an absolute bargain if you're looking for the specific feature set that this thing offers. I don't know if it beats the competition at every single level, but as of right now, this thing is definitely getting a very high recommendation from me. Now, the physical build is actually pretty simple. You have your RCA inputs and pre-outs that are automatically switched to if a headphone is pulled out of the front. Then you have your DC 15 volt input in the back and your power switch on the front, which also adjusts your gain from 0 dB to plus 6 dB, a 1/4 inch single-ended output, and a 4.4 millimeter balanced output, and your volume knob. Couple notes here. The balanced output is not technically truly balanced, unlike the A90. That's one of those features that you do have to sort of compromise on. It's RCA inputs only, so you're taking a single-ended and it's splitting it into a false balanced signal out the front. Now, you still get some of the benefits like the power. This thing actually puts out 3.4 watts into 32 ohms out of that balanced output. So for such a small little device, this thing actually does pack quite a bit of a punch. Now, I know a lot of spec and measurement based people are going to be saying, well, that's not the most amount of power at this price tag. And you're right, it isn't, but there are other specs that are among the best in this price tag, and power is a part of the equation, but it's not the whole story. Now, slightly back to the build here, the volume knob is very, very tiny, and it's kind of hard to get a good feeling on. And especially when you have a cable plugged in the 4.4 millimeter, your actionable area with your fingers is pretty minimal. So you're gonna have to be doing a little bit of a slight pinching and twisting effort to change the volume on this. Now, that is sort of unfortunately a result of just small builds like this in general. Now, I kind of wish that they had implemented some sort of a top volume control like a Shithell or a JDS Labs element. It would lose some of the stackability that this has, and they do have a number of stack components that can go on this, including a DAC and a power supply if you're into that. But for use case, I think that would have been a little bit more convenient than this really, really small knob. Or maybe perhaps, for $215 instead of $200, you could include like remote support for volume control via remote. Now, a while ago, I actually made a video talking about what the best balance cables were and why you might choose balance. And this is one of those examples why I chose 4.4 millimeter as the ideal balanced cable type, even though I think XLR is probably a better standard and it's probably worth investing more in an XLR. But this is one of those examples where an XLR would not have fit inside this thing. So that 4.4 millimeter balance, if you wanted to get balanced between 2.5 millimeter and 4.4 millimeter, I'm really glad they went with the 4.4 on this, as well as going with the 4.4 optional, as well as XLR on the topping A90. At this point, if you're really invested in this system, it might actually be worth investing in a 4.4 millimeter balanced cable rather than the adapter to go from 4.4 to XLR. So specs are obviously very important for this, and it doesn't lead the class in terms of power. I think that probably goes to the Schiit Magnus for $200. But what it does do is offer very, very good measurements and a couple of small benefits over something like a Magnus, mainly in the IEM performance. But real quick before I compare against the Magnus, I do want to mention the performance and the sound differences between this and the topping A90. Now, for the most part, if you're playing within a medium range of headphones that you don't need a substantial amount of power or aren't incredibly efficient, I actually think that this sounds exactly the same as the A90, which is very impressive given the spec capability of that A90, given the fact that it's probably one of the best headphones on the planet currently at any price. This keeping up in terms of sound quality, which is, yes, subject to my errors as a listener, but I perceive no difference between normal listening conditions with regular headphones. Things like Sundaras, things like HC6XXs, that sort of thing. I think the performance here is just about equal. Now, there's a couple nuances to this conversation and a couple reasons why you might prefer this unit over the A90 or even the Magnus, and a couple reasons why you might prefer the Magnus or the A90. So in the balanced output of this, again, for normal headphones, the sound quality similar to the A90 is incredibly transparent, very clear. Probably at this price, I would consider it the most neutral sounding for at least the balanced output that I think you can get. I think it's just got this perfect sense of clarity and transparency, and it doesn't really add anything to the sound. It doesn't take away anything to the sound. You get perfect placement for instruments where they are supposed to be, and you get good resolution capabilities, good timbre characteristics, everything you could want. Honestly, I think it's really great. Now, the single-ended performance, while weaker than the balanced performance, does have some weird characteristics when you plug in IEMs. Now, it's only one weird characteristic, and I actually think it might even be a benefit for the right user, including myself. And I swear this thing has stronger bass than that of the A90. The A90 seems more correct and seems more in tune with the way that the IEMs I have here, being the Fur M5s, the Empire Ears Odin, and currently the Moondrop Starfields. I know how those headphones are supposed to sound, and it sounds more proper and correct on the A90, but on this, they actually seem a bit bassier than on the A90, at least out of the quarter-inch single-ended performance. Now, this is maybe not as correct and subject to my own errors, again, as a listener, because it's kind of minor, but I swear the bass is quite a bit stronger. But it's not like loosely bloated. It's not like adding bass boost via EQ. It seems like it's properly driven, and it's almost like each headphone has a slightly bassier retuning without affecting the mid-range or the top end. Similar to that of the A90 review that I talked about, part of the reason why I think it's the best is because it drives everything from crazy efficient IEMs that show you the problems with everything to extremely difficult to drive planars like Susvaras. Half of that is true on the A50S. It won't push those really crazy top of the line headphones that are just need bucket loads of power. It won't do that. But it will have incredibly clean performance for the other end, which is those crazy efficient IEMs. So those Fur M5s, similar to the A90 with hearing no noise floor on this. Pretty nice. Now, the only issue I've had with IEMs for this is that when you turn the volume all the way off on the more efficient stuff like the M5s, again, they highlight everything, you will hear a tiny bit of the music playing through this. And it doesn't completely mute and completely turn off, unlike some other amps. Now, on anything more efficient than like the most efficient stuff, you're not really going to hear that. And there is a little bit of a noise floor in low gain on those IEMs after about halfway, but I'm usually listening to it about a quarter of the way up on those Fur M5s, which are going to show the noise floor more than other IEMs. Okay, now for comparisons against the A90 and the Magnus. Now, the A90 obviously has some features over this that are perhaps more enticing to get. The size is bigger. It's a more substantial feeling amplifier, although this does feel denser than that does. That still is a really well-built amplifier. It has XLR, so you may not have to buy additional cables or an adapter if you already have XLR cables. It's truly balanced, unlike the A50 is, and it has XLR outputs that you can play towards studio monitors and have a fully balanced in and fully balanced out system. So there are some benefits over that. And it also can drive those top-end planars as well as the IEMs and everything in between. But it's also $500 and doesn't have the form factor that this has. And that's kind of the main benefits for this over the A90, form factor and price. I think dollar for dollar for the Magnus, it's probably like a better amp. It's probably, it's more capable for the same amount of money. But there are some nuances and some potential choices you have to make between this and the Magnus. I think the IEM performance is more enjoyable and has less of a noise floor on the A50S. And the form factor, again, is a huge selling point to the right person. Now the shit here is obviously bigger, but it does have a fully balanced XLR system, both inputs and pre-outs and an output out the front that is actually legitimately balanced. It also creates a little bit more power and has really, really good specs, although I don't think the measurements are quite as clean as this, but the measurements are so clean on both that I don't think it'd be a major problem. Now, the other thing here is your potential DAC options and sort of the functionality that you can get when you pair this with a DAC. So the Magnus, I think, is best paired with the Modius to make the shittiest stack ever. But if you wanted to stay with the topping house sound and brand, I actually think you could look at something like a DX3 Pro. Instead of the DAC that's supposed to fit this, yes, you're going to be dealing with a build mismatch, but you get the addition of Bluetooth on that DX3 Pro, as well as pretty clean measurements. Now, it's not as clean as the DAC that gets paired with this, but I think the addition of Bluetooth might be worth it to the right user, and you still get two small form factor devices that plug right in and you're good to go. Okay, so conclusions. This is not the pinnacle. It's not the best, but it does have some features that I think are going to be really appealing to the right person. And it's certainly performing at the top of its class, while maybe not, pound for pound being the absolute king. Now, I do think that this is still a very good unit and still worth a mention. And if you were to plop this on my desk and say, this is what you got forever, I'd be perfectly fine with it. Okay, guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you in the next video. Until then, my name's Josh, signing off.